Greetings, brothers and sisters in Christ. Now we're at part 3 of our funeral workshop series. This one is going to focus on the story you tell and the story that you want to tell in your funeral and how that will look like in our services. So part 1, just to recap, part 1 was the theology of humanity, theology of life and death, the theology of resurrection, the theology of baptism and its connection to the resurrection of Christ and our own resurrection from the dead. Part 2 talked about what makes a good funeral good, the tools that we have at our disposal, the theology that we have that guides our funeral worship, and the role that the congregation plays, the role that theology plays, the role that the pastor plays in that good funeral service versus sort of the American cultural funeral that we are beginning to see in the memorial services, the celebrations of life, the meaningless ceremonies that we experience when we go to funerals outside of the church. And so this third part is the practical part, the part where decisions are made on your part, and I'm here to sort of guide and inform and instruct you. And in many ways, this is some of what I do with the family after someone has died. So if someone dies and the family is trying to plan a funeral with me, I'll go through some of this information with them. I'll show them a sample bulletin. I'll show them sample texts. I'll encourage them to sort of, I'll ask some of the questions that I'm going to ask of you, go through some of the rules, regulations, philosophies that are behind my funerals. And so that's what this is, and I'm going to show you some of the information and forms. And there's from Concordia Publishing House, this is a book called Final Victory, Contemplating the Death and Funeral of a Christian. It's from CPH, written by a pastor named Brian Wolfmueller, who was he was a pastor in Denver, I think, when he wrote this, but he is now a pastor in Texas. He took a different call. He serves a congregation, I think, in Austin. He actually serves two. One, your typical congregation, and your second one was his second one is a congregation to the deaf. He's got a deaf ministry in Texas as well. And so he wrote this book. It is very LCMS. It walks through the funeral service, which is kind of what I'm going to do here. So if you want to skip this video and go buy this book and read it for yourself, you're going to get just about the same thing out of it for $8.99 or whatever it costs on Amazon or cph.com. But it also, this is where I get the pre-planning worksheets from. So you're going to see that on the camera in a little bit. So if you want to know where I got those sheets, that's where they're in the back of this book. I may have a legally made copies of it, but it does say it's reproduced by permission, so I think I have permission to reproduce them. So it says on the bottom copyright, but I don't necessarily have the permission to distribute them necessarily. I don't know how copyright laws work in reality. So if you come to my office, I'll make you a copy of the pre-planning worksheets. If you're at home and you can't have me come show up, maybe buy the book so you can get the worksheets. Or if you're not my sheep, my parishioner, then buy the book on your own as well, and then share it with your pastor, whoever that may be. So that's this. You're going to see that in a little bit. And then let's jump into the slides. So again, I titled this section, The Story You Tell. Now, a Lutheran funeral follows a structure and a liturgy from the Lutheran service book, which you saw in the previous section, but you know what a hymnal looks like. That's what it's called. It's called the Lutheran service book. It's what it says on the side. It's the standard hymnal at Trinity Lutheran Church in Hammond, Indiana. It's the standard hymnal in probably 95 to 98% of LCMS churches in the United States. I mean, there's still some people using the red and blue ones, but they're pretty few and far between. And even those hymnals use the same structure. The funeral liturgy has in general stayed the same. Some of the wording is a little bit different, and the font and those sort of things. There are the propers. So the propers are the elements that you change in a service. So if you want to know what the propers are in your general Sunday service, it's the texts and the hymns. So your intro, it changes, your Old Testament reading, your Psalm reading, your gradual, your epistle, your gospel reading, the sermon is all proper. It's an element that changes. There are things that don't change. things like the Invocation, the benediction, Nunc Dimittis, those are sorts of things that don't, no matter what Sunday it is, those are in the service sort of thing. Absolution and confession, all that. There are other options in a funeral service. When you're dealing with a Lutheran funeral, you have a couple different options. One of them is processing in and out. And sometimes that just gets determined by the plan and the body. So if you are in a casket, and if you plan to be in a casket and you plan to be buried and you plan to be buried after the church service, then the funeral director can help process in from the narthex in the back into the front, and then you can process out into the back door and then out into the hearse. And so that kind of determines a little bit on the structure of your church. So if you're not at Trinity Hammond, but say you're at St. Paul's Bremen, or you're at Redeemer Highland, or wherever, that movement may be different, and maybe because of the way the building's built, it could just be different. And so I'm thinking about changing how this happens, and it would have to require some coordination with funeral directors as they come in and whatnot, but that's something I'd have to know ahead of time. Because right now we don't process in. The casket is usually already in the church when we get started, and then it's processed out if it's in a casket. So the casket is put in, and then so usually in a Trinity funeral, what often happens is the casket arrives 2 hours before service. It gets set up, flowers are arranged, everything's sort of in its place, and then the family comes about an hour before the service. They have a family visitation with the casket open, and then some people you may greet and do things like that, go through the sort of a line sort of thing, have a visitation period, and then the casket is closed when service begins, and then the family may process in on their own, but I've kind of stopped doing that because there was a tradition with the former two pastors that they would kind of meet the family outside the fellowship hall, have a devotion then, and then they kind of process in, and I kind of lead them in, and then they go to the side and I go to the front, and that's sort of how it was done. I haven't found, in my experience with a couple funerals that are here at the church, that the family wants to have a devotion beforehand. They'd rather kind of sit in the pews and just be ready and kind of get the family gathered, because there's kids to try and wrangle and trying to get everybody to be quiet, and people are coming in late, and that's the problem with the entrance being right there. So if you're trying to have a devotion right outside in the fellowship hall, people are still coming in because they're coming in a minute or two after the service is supposed to start, and it's 9 o'clock, it's 10 o'clock, and it's 10:01, and people are coming through, and you're trying to have a prayer, and people are like, I'm sorry, I'm walking around, and it's distracting, and nobody really likes it. So I've kind of done away with that, and I try to do a devotion before people start gathering in that hour beforehand. So if they show up, the funeral's at 10 and they show up at 9, I'll have a short prayer with them then before sort of that visitation period happens, and that'll kind of be it. And then they can be gathered in the pew when its time comes. So that's sort of how that movement, we don't have that processing in sort of thing here. I'd like to try and figure out how to do it, just as after doing this Bible study and thinking about funerals and how I do it and how the process works here at Trinity. I've been trying to figure out how to tweak the process a bit. None of that's really necessarily important to this slide, but that's okay. So then there's other options. The other option is the funeral pall, which I highly encourage for church funerals. If you're going to have your funeral at church and you're going to have a casket, put the funeral pall on. It may bother the people who paid for the flowers to be on your casket. Tough. You are representing yourself as a baptized Christian, not as a beloved father and grandfather that the flower array or spray has. Just put it aside. It's fine. They'll put it back on when you're at the cemetery. But in the church, you put on the baptismal garment one last time. And that's what the funeral pall is all about. It's the baptismal garment for the casket. And I think here at Trinity, we do have a smaller funeral pall kind of made for urns. So if you are cremated, we still have a pall to put on over the urn. So even if your cremated remains are in, we have a little table, you put it on the cremated remains, we have a funeral little pall to put over that as well. And so you can go both ways, even if whether you're embalmed or whether you're cremated, we have a funeral pall for you at Trinity. So there's that. The service outline, if you've been to a Lutheran funeral, they're all the same. They follow the same outline. It's invocation, remembrance of baptism, psalm or intro at Kyrie, collect, readings, Apostles' Creed, which is also the baptismal creed, sermon, prayer of the church, Lord's Prayer, Nunc Dimittis, Cluniac, benediction. That's what it is. Then The optional parts are readings and hymns. So if you want to put input hymns, usually there are 3. Standard number is 3. You can have 4, you can have 5, you can have 2. Usually don't have just one, though you could have a performance, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But usually the hymns, you have an opening hymn, a closing hymn, a sermon hymn. Those are your 3 main hymns. You can also have, if you want a 4th hymn, it bookend the sermon. So you have a pre-sermon hymn and a post-sermon hymn. So that'd be your 2 spots, but you need a beginning and a closing. If you have a 5th hymn, you might stick it between readings. If you have a 6th hymn, you're putting it between maybe prayers, or again between readings, or you're just sticking into places. Again, it might depend on the themes of the hymn. Performances likewise have to get slotted into different spots. Then you also have a Lutheran burial liturgy, and so there's a committal service, which is an extension of the funeral service. It needs to be understood that it's an extension of, a continuation of the funeral service, and that sort of goes along with that movement that we were talking about in part 2, from the church to the cemetery. It used to be a short walk, now it's kind of a drive, but it's still a continuation of the service. I often don't change my clothes. So if I was wearing an alb at the funeral service, I'm going to be wearing an alb at the graveside. If I'm at a funeral home and I'm wearing a collar, I'm going to be wearing the same collar at the graveside. Because in a sense the service is continuing, it hasn't ended yet, but there is that benediction at the funeral anyway, because people are departing. It also has a structure, and there's not a lot of things for you to change or to choose in the committal, because it's an extension of the funeral service. We've already sort of done the customization part of that, and the committal is a bit more straightforward. You have the invocation, you usually read a psalm or 2, you have a short reading, 2 to 3 short readings. Then there's a prayer, there's a couple more readings, then there's a committal to the resting place, a blessing upon the body. The Lord's Prayer is said over the body one last time. A final collect, an Easter acclamation, Alleluia, Christ is risen, He is risen indeed, Alleluia. That's said at the end of every funeral. Why? Because funerals are all about resurrection. And then the benediction, and then you go. And so that's how you're committed to the ground. There are places and there are cultures and customs in which you would lower the body and throw dirt onto the casket as part of that ritual, and there's a spot for that as well. But again, that's not necessarily a Northern Indiana custom that I've found. No one has asked for that. I think they did it in Texas, and a couple funerals I went to there. Kansas, it wasn't too prevalent. So that it just depends. It depends on what you ask for. It depends on what you arrange with the funeral home. There isn't a need for it. If so, you're thinking, oh, should I have this? You don't need it. You can ask for the body to be lowered at the end of the service, sort of thing. So you can have the people standing by. There's always people standing by to make sure you don't fall in the hole or things don't go wrong. And it's coordinated by the funeral director. And so there's always a guy or 2 standing by that they can lower the casket. And so you can stick that in usually at the end after the benediction, though you could put it in the middle as well, right before the committal to the resting place. So you commit the person to the resting place, bless the body, do the Lord's Prayer over it, and then your body is lowered, and then you do a final prayer and sort of end the service that way. Usually no hymns being sung here because you're outside. Sometimes it's cold, sometimes it's rainy, sometimes you can't hear. Usually there aren't any songs being done just because you've got a smaller group, nobody wants to sing a cappella. And it's mostly the family here at the committal stage in the game, and they're not, there's a lot of tears at this stage, and not a lot of singing. So you'd have to rely on congregational members who usually don't travel to this section. After that, again, the story you tell with the propers and hymns, you can direct the theme and the main story of the day to a degree. Sermons are outside your control. In other words, you don't get to tell me what I preach on. You could try, but you're dead. So I get to choose. And so when you're dealing with propers and picking texts and picking hymns, you recognize that these things have themes. They have points of emphasis. The texts for Ash Wednesday are different than the texts for Easter, which are different than the texts for Epiphany and Advent and Christmas. And you recognize that church year, you have different points of emphasis. The same thing happens with funerals. And so there are texts that are meant for funerals, that are good for funerals, that are great for funerals, and there are bad texts and bad hymns. And there are bad hymns in general sometimes, and there are good hymns and better hymns. But you want those to all sort of tie together to be a cohesive story, and to work together to sort of push your theme throughout the day, or throughout the hour that we're there. And how do you decide these sort of things? What sort of things are useful? What sort of texts are beneficial? Confirmation verses are great. They're great reminders of your spiritual life. These are texts that often find meaning throughout your life, especially if you know what they are. So for example, my confirmation is Ephesians 2:8-9. By grace you have been saved, not by works, lest any man should boast. And so the fact that a Lutheran preacher preaches on faith alone through grace has found its way embedded into my life. And did Pastor Rhodey know that when he picked it when I was in 8th grade, when I was planning to be anything but a pastor? No, he didn't know that, but it just sort of finds its way in reflecting in their life. The Revelation 2:10 about crown of life and perseverance, that finds a way in people's lives, and that helps with a story that you can tell. And the Joshua 20-something or whatever about, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, and Psalm 1 or Psalm 23 or whatever. There's a standard set of confirmation verses, and if you know your confirmation verse, that helps the pastor tell the story. It tells your story. It applies that text to your life in some way, because these texts are given to you in the laying on of hands in this confirmation service, and it does mean something, and we recognize that it means something, and it does shape us in some way. And so that confirmation verse, if you know it, can be a great source of textual theme for the day. This also connects to your baptism and connects then to your death. Second is wedding marriage text. If you're married, do you remember the text that your pastor preached on while you were getting married? That has told the story of your Christian life in some way, right? So the marriage text shaped your marriage, and marriage was a big part of your life and how you raised kids. That helps tell the story. Do you have a favorite passage? Do you have a passage that you turn to? Everybody thinks that grandma's favorite passage, I said this in the workshop, everybody thinks that grandma's favorite passage is Psalm 23 because she reads it all the time in her hospital room. It's like, well, yeah, she's dying. That's the text you read when you're dying. Maybe when you're healthy, you're not reading Psalm 23 every week. I don't read Psalm 23 all that often. I have other texts that I like. But if I'm dying, then Psalm 23 is sort of on my mind. And so when people start paying attention to what grandma's reading in her Bible every week while she's dying, they're going to think Psalm 23 is your favorite passage. So maybe write down what your actual favorite passage is. And if Psalm 23 is your favorite passage, that's fine too. But I imagine that you don't think about dying every day. Again, depending on your situation. So maybe you have a favorite passage. Maybe it's a passage that means something to you, that matters to you, that you find comfort in, or that's just stuck with you. And so you have those passages. As Christians, you've spent decades in the church. There's got to be something that sticks with you in some way, shape, or form. So write it down. Put it on a piece of paper. Tell your family that it's important to you and why. And they'll respect and cherish that more than almost anything else. And I'll talk about that with the forms. Hymns. I strongly encourage hymns that are in both the local hymnal and are regularly sung by the congregation. Do not pick some off-the-wall song that nobody knows, that nobody can sing, and that nobody's heard of. What am I supposed to do with that as your pastor? I don't know. Pick something out of the hymnal. There are 650 hymns, 700 hymns in this hymnal. You can't find 3 good ones? Come on. I got to find 5 good ones every Sunday. You can find one for you can find 3 or 4 for your funeral. It's not that hard. And don't pick meaningless drivel, right? If you're going to pick a song, have it mean something. Have it help tell the story. Have it have a textual basis in Scripture. No, don't be about the flowers and the trees and the winds and the sun and isn't it beautiful? No. Confess Christ and Him crucified and risen. That's your job. Hymns tell stories like text. They often have text as their basis. They're telling the story of some text. Listen to them. Listen to what they're saying. Is that helpful to the story you're trying to tell? What story are you trying to tell? Listen to parts 1 and 2. If you don't know what story you're supposed to tell, watch those videos and figure it out. Because if it's not serving those purposes, then it's not serving the purpose of your funeral. Some examples. Easter hymns are great hymns for funerals. Why? Because the theme is resurrection. What's the theme of Easter? Resurrection. Easter hymns are great. Alleluia, Jesus is risen, with the refrain, Jesus is risen and we shall arise, give God the glory, alleluia. Great Easter hymn, everybody knows it, it's in the hymnal, it proclaims your resurrection with Christ's resurrection. Great. I know that my Redeemer lives. Maybe don't sing all 8 verses, we get a little tired of it, maybe split it in 2 parts, that's fine too. You can open it with it. First 4 verses, you can close with the last 4 verses. That's fine. 8 whole verses at one time, people get a little antsy about that. You can cut out a couple verses. Whatever. Look at it. Decide what you want. Baptismal hymns are great. As I said in part 2, baptism is the foundation of a funeral. Baptismal hymns are perfectly acceptable. All Christians who have been baptized, all who believe and are baptized, 596 and 601, confess baptismal or not only the new life of baptism, but the resurrection in them as well. Those are great hymns for funerals. In the hymnal, there are sections, so it's subdivided into different themes. So you have Advent and then Christmas hymns and then Epiphany hymns and then Transfiguration hymns and then Ash Wednesday hymns and then Lent hymns and then Holy Week hymns and then Easter hymns and then church justification hymns, Redeemer hymns, justification, Word of the Church, baptism, Lord's Supper, all those sort of things. Look at the top corner of the page and you'll find the theme of that hymn. And there are 3 sections that are best suited for hymns: Church Triumphant, Trust, and Hope and Comfort. If you want to know funeral hymns, if you have some traditional funeral hymn in mind, it's probably in Hope and Comfort, because Hope and Comfort really just means funeral hymns. But they don't say funeral hymns, they say Hope and Comfort. So those are the sections for hymns that you can look for. Here, I'll take that off the page. Hope and Comfort, there it is. Those are what you should be looking for in that. Examples for texts. As I said, these are both personal and confessional. You are telling a story through the text that you pick, and they are to convey a purposeful story. The sermon and the hymns should tie in with these texts in some way, at least with one of them. Your hymns don't have to tie in with your marriage text. Again, we're not preaching your marriage all over again. We're preaching your death. So it's a supplement to the story, not the main focus of it. And as long as it can be identified as that in the bulletin too, so people know, oh, this is their marriage text. That's nice. I'm glad they included it. But the real focus is on, this text or that text. Here I have a list of texts that I have preached funeral sermons on, and it's just a sampling. I can preach on any text. It's my job. But some of my sermons that I like and I have used again and again. Yes, I reuse some funeral funeral sermons. 1, because I can, and 2, because the people that are in this audience change, and so they don't remember the old sermon, so they don't know that it's old. But anyway, so Isaiah 25, 6-9, that's the Lord swallows up death forever on the mountain of Zion. It's the feast of of good food and of wine, well-aged wine, well-refined. Lord swallows up death on the mountain. 1 Corinthians 15 is the resurrection chapter. You can pick any 6, 7, 8 verses out of that chapter, and it's going to be a perfect text for a resurrection story theme. 51 to 59, I think, is the standard text about the imperishable, or the perishable shall put on the imperishable, and the seed of wheat has to die in order to be raised or to have new life. Those sort of things. So that's 1 Corinthians 15. You already seen Romans 6 if you listen to part 1. That's about being baptized into Christ's death and his resurrection. So we have a resurrection like his. That's easily preachable. Ezekiel 37 is not a text a lot of people think about, but it's one that I think about all the time. I used this for Norman Simhauser's funeral in Kansas. It was the text of the day. It was one of the lectionary texts, and I just thought it was a perfect sermon text for his funeral. So the theme of that question is the theme of that text is it's the dry bones, the valley of dry bones, and then you get the song, them bones, them dry bones. And no, you don't get to pick that hymn or that song for your funeral. It'd be hilarious, but no, that's not the tone we're going for. It is instead, the theme question of that text is, can these bones live? That's what God asks Ezekiel in his vision. Can these bones live? Can this valley of dead people live? And Ezekiel says, Lord, you know. It's in a sense, it's the answer to, only you have the power to raise the dead, O Lord. I can't make that call as a human being. And so we sort of recognize that it's God's power to raise the dead, and it's God's promise to raise the dead, and that's what we find in Christ. So Ezekiel 37 is a good text for funerals, believe it or not. Job 19, 21 to 27, that's with the promise of seeing God with my own eyes. So Job confesses the resurrection of the dead, a bodily resurrection of the dead because he has eyes to see, and it's his eyes. Revelation 21 confesses the new heavens and new earth. You could tie that in with Isaiah 61, I think, as well. 66 also has some promises there. Also has some promises of damnation. You probably want to avoid those texts unless you really want to make a statement about going to hell and eternal torment. So don't do that. John 6, bread of life, and will be raised on the last day. So that's Jesus' promise to raise those who eat of the bread of life, eat of Christ, to be raised on the last day. And then Luke 2, the Nunc Dimittis. Lord, I depart in peace. I can now depart in peace because I have seen my salvation. I use that for a funeral at Trinity as well. So those are just, I went to my funeral record of sermons that I've preached, and those are some of the texts. There are more texts to choose from, and more, there's a list. There's a list that pastors have to choose text from, and they'll offer suggestions to members. On eulogies, it's always an important question. Should we have eulogies at our funeral? The answer is no. And you might think, well, what if it's my cousin Jimmy and I still say no? What if the person is a pastor at another church and I really want them to speak on and talk about my life? No. Still no. Still no. No. However, there is a limit to the power that I have as pastor. And you can take advantage of those limits if you so choose. Or you can make me happy, and on your pre-planning worksheets, you can put somewhere, no eulogies. And then you put your initials by it, so that your family knows you don't want to be eulogized. You want a sermon by a Christian pastor who preaches the gospel. That's what you want. You don't want Uncle Jimmy going off on your fishing story about how the boat tipped over and you lost all your beer and the trip was somewhat ruined, but then you still had good humor about it and you were able to salvage the vacation, and it just drags on. So, if someone insists that Cousin Joey needs to speak, there are three options that I offer. 1, do it at the luncheon. Encourage people to have their little speaking moments at the lunch that follows the service. Every funeral has a lunch with the family that gets together, whether it's at home, whether it's at Teeble's, whether it's at this place or that place or the fellowship hall. I don't care. That's when you get together and you share memories. You share stories. It's not the funeral. It's not the committal. It's not the church service. It's outside the church service where people can share stories and they can get teary-eyed, and it's not a distraction because it's around people that you love and your family and friends. That's fine. That's when you do it. You do it at the lunch, not the funeral. If that doesn't satisfy people, then I will offer to allow it after the committal. When I'm done with the service and I've said my final benediction, do whatever you want at the graveside. I'm out. I shake hands with the family. I say, peace, O Lord, be with you. I do the benediction, and I walk away because my job is done for the day. I have done my work, and I walk away. And then if you want to get up and you want to chat for 15 minutes about cousin whatever, or uncle this, or dad used to say this all the time, and he would have really liked this or not liked this, or this is the weather that he really likes, whatever. I'm done. The service is over. Do whatever you want. The third option, and my least favorite option, is before the committal begins. So we've had the funeral at the church, we've gotten and we've processed out, the people are in the cars, you go to the graveside service, people are gathered together, and you want to speak in front of everybody, now's your chance. Do it before I start back up again. Yes, the committal is a continuation of the funeral service. However, because you've driven in a car for 15 minutes to the graveside, there's sort of been a mental break, and it's fine because I'll just do another invocation and sort of continue on when you're done speaking. It is my least favorite option of the three, My truly least favorite option is to think that you're going to interrupt my service and be able to just speak and do whatever you want. But, that's the way it goes. There's a fourth option that I don't have on here because I really don't like it, and that's before the funeral. And you can do this at a funeral home and not the church service. So if you want to avoid this option, don't have your funeral at a funeral home. Have it at church. Because at church, I have the power to control who speaks and who doesn't, because it's my sanctuary. It's the Lord's sanctuary. I'm the guy in charge. And so if you're at a funeral home, I don't have the authority to say what can and can't happen at a funeral home. And because a funeral home's job is to customize to their clientele, they'll let you do whatever you want within reason. And so the fourth option there is if you're at a funeral home, you can have people speak before I get started. And then you can share stories while the people are there. And then I'll have to, if you say something heretical, I'll have to correct you in the sermon. So those are your options for eulogies if you so choose to have them. You shouldn't choose to have them, but there you go. Performances. Do not ask your loved one to perform at your funeral. Don't do it. It's highly emotional. Rarely is it done well unless they don't love you that much, or they're not that close to you. So what do I mean by that? I mean that if your daughter is a fantastic singer and you die, she's going to cry trying to sing. And maybe you want to see that emotion from your daughter, who's often, more rigid or uptight and doesn't show a lot of emotion on her sleeve. Don't do that. She's there to mourn. She's there to grieve. And so that's your family's role in this funeral, is to grieve and to mourn the loss of you. Those who are distant from you, those who don't have an emotional attachment to you, they can perform. Like the members of the congregation who aren't in your family. Yes, they're your brothers and sisters in Christ, and yes, they're sad that you've died. But you know what? They didn't spend every Friday night with you. They didn't spend every night of the week with you for 20 years while they were growing up. They don't have all those memories, all that emotion tied to it. So if you want someone to perform at your funeral, have it be a church member, have it be someone from another church, have it be a church choir, have it be an instrumentalist from the community. Find a violinist to perform a song that you like or something. That's fine. They can do the prelude music. That's no big deal if that's what the music you want. Find it ahead of time. Arrange it. But don't ask, granddaughter Susie to sing "Jesus Loves Me, This I Know" and expect to have it be a good memory for her. She's going to be traumatized. So if you really need little Susie to sing your hymn, and this is just a fact of life in the church, I'll put her in the balcony. And at least then she's hidden from view. One, so she doesn't take center stage, because that's the job of Christ. And two, because if she does start crying, everybody's not going to see her crying, and it won't, snowball into disaster. So remember, the focus is on Christ and the deceased. There's no need to distract from this purpose. There's no need. If it doesn't serve that purpose, cut it. Doesn't belong. Miscellaneous items. As I said, funeral pall is optional, but it is a beautiful symbol. The colors for a funeral are that of the liturgical season. I will not change the colors of the altar and the pulpit and the lectern because you think purple is the better color. Purple's for Lent, blue's for Advent, green is common time and Epiphany, white is Christmas and Easter. That's the seasons. If you want to have a certain color at your funeral, time your death better. I'm not getting the Altar Guild to change the colors for you. I think there's maybe, and again, because pastors are drama queens, sometimes pastoral funerals sometimes change the colors to red, but that's, again, unnecessary, and I haven't done too many pastor funerals. I've attended one or two, but it's sort of like ordinations aren't supposed to go red either, but it's supposed to be the color of the church year, yet everybody just sort of decides that if you're having an ordination or an installation, it's red. Okay. Flags. So flags may be placed on casket prior to the funeral and after the funeral. It's avoided during the service due to the story that we're trying to tell. So if you've served in the military and you're going to have a flag on your casket because you're a veteran, that's fine. It can be there before the service, sort of in maybe the visitation period. It can be there after the service. So if your casket's draped, or it's got a folded flag on top of it instead of a flower spray, that's fine after the service to put it back on. But when you're in the sanctuary, you are a Christian first and not a soldier, not a veteran, but a Christian. You're a brother and sister in Christ, and so that's when that happens. It happens outside of the funeral service. Military honors are acceptable. I've done funerals for veterans in which military services have been rendered by the National Guard or the Marines or whomever. Usually those services are rendered at the graveside, and they usually occur either before or after the committal rite, usually after. So I'll do my part, and then they do their part, and then they hand the flag to the family, and then I will greet the family, and then I'll leave, and they'll leave, and that's sort of how that works. So they wait till in a sense, the military knows that a funeral and a committal are tied together, and they wait till the end of it to do their stuff. That's usually how that goes. I know in some places obituaries are sometimes read, but not typically in the funeral service. There's no place in the liturgy for an obituary to be read. Though I'm not opposed to having obituaries placed on the back of bulletins, stuff like that. If you want to put your obituary in the bulletin, that's usually fine. Or if you've got a poem or something that's not, like the poem from part 1, then that's where I'll usually find a place for is on the back of a bulletin or in the bulletin somewhere. Same thing with if you've got a granddaughter who wants to read a poem or something, then instead of having her do it in the middle of service, you put it in the bulletin, and then everybody can read it on their own time and be moved by her words. Or if you've got a poem that you've written or your wife wrote or whatever, that's where I'll put that. So there's also church obituaries, and I put those in quotes. Church obituaries I don't have the book up here in the studio. I didn't bring it along. But they're sample obituaries that contain your dates for things. So your birth, your baptism, your confirmation, your marriage, and your death are all included, and then your spouse, if you were married, and your kids are mentioned. And so it's all in sort of a Christian language. It's all in that sort of framework. So, he was raised to new life in baptism on February 5th of, 72, and he has 3 kids. He was blessed in marriage to this spouse, and they had this many years of marriage and these children. And it sort of has this Christian, it structures the dates around your Christian story, your Christian life. And so now is the time to plan, and I'll show you the sheets here real quick. So I don't have a sample funeral bulletin, but if you are in church in the next couple weeks, as you rightfully should be, then you can look at the hymnal. So the hymnal has the funeral service. I don't know if you know that. Again, you're probably not, looking for it necessarily. But in the order of services, let's see, I think it's after comp line, prayer and preaching, holy baptism. So it goes baptism, confirmation, matrimony, and funeral service. So on page 278, and I will switch cameras here. 278, you have the funeral service. See, right there, 278. And you can see the general outlines. Invocation, remembrance of baptism, introit psalm, entrance hymn, Kyrie, salutation and collect, readings, creed, hymn of the day, sermon, prayer of the church, Lord's Prayer. The Nunc Dimittis is spoken. It's not typically sung. Including collect and benediction. And then let us go forth in peace in the name of the Lord. Hymn may be sung as the casket's led in procession out of the church. So closing hymn, opening hymn, hymn of the day, those are the 3 hymns you have to have. So that's that sample bulletin. Again, 278 to 281 in your hymnal. Here we have personal information, funeral planning worksheet. This has your name, your birthday, your address, home, phone number, cell phone, work number, those sort of things. Then it has this fun little statement, and it's sort of important for you to recognize. I understand that the information and instructions provided here are for the guidance of my congregation, my family, my friends, for making arrangements necessary at the time of my death. Although this information is being left for safekeeping, it is not legally binding or enforceable. Why? Because you're dead. I understand that this worksheet does not make the congregation or my family obliged or responsible for the execution of these instructions. In other words, if you say something stupid in these sheets, I don't have to listen. Yes, that is true. But like if your funeral is occurring on some day, like near Easter or near Christmas, I might not choose the same text that I would normally do. Depends on the season and sort of what things are around. Like some things just aren't fitting depending on the day. Or if there was some sort of national tragedy 2 days before, maybe I'm not going to do, I may have to use your funeral as a means to preach on that. So then in the funeral planning worksheet, we have the confessing Christ with my funeral. That's sort of the idea of telling your own story. And here is, I think this page is the most important page for you to fill out for the sake of your family. And for my sake too, but I don't, whatever. I can pick texts. But here's a point in which you get to write a confession of faith that your family will read when you're gone. And they can find comfort in your faith that you confess here. Yes, you confess your faith in the Apostles' and Nicene Creed and the Athanasian Creed when you feel like showing up on a Trinity Sunday. But those are impersonal. Here's a personal confession in your own handwriting, the things that mean something to you, the meaning you find in these texts, and how they tell a story that you confess. And so, what is the thing you want to confess in your funeral? Do you want to proclaim, the importance of baptism? Do you want to proclaim the importance of resurrection from the dead? Do you want to proclaim that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life? Do you want to proclaim that God will raise the dead and fulfill His promises? Do you want to proclaim the new heavens and the new earth? What is it that you want to, where do you want your Christian hope to find its point of emphasis in your funeral? And you have those choices. And maybe what your family is going to need to hear or needs to be encouraged. Maybe you've got 3 grandkids that haven't been baptized yet, and you kind of want the importance of baptism to be preached at your funeral because that's what you care about. Maybe, you've got people who don't understand why grandma cares so much about, life after death and being with the Lord. And maybe you want to talk about the new heavens and new earth and the joy and the peace that you have in Christ. These are points of emphasis that you have and that you have texts at your disposal for. And so what text do you see as serving that theme? You've got a psalm, an Old Testament, an epistle, a gospel, all those things. Again, they don't all have to tie together. You can write down, I like this old, and you can write down more than one, by the way, and that gives your pastor some options to work with because he's maybe more theologically astute than you are and knows how to tie things together in a little bit better way, or knows what's fitting, or he knows what he can cut down or expand upon. Because sometimes people will choose like their confirmation verse and it's one verse or a half verse or 2 verses, and you need, a text is more than that. So he needs to be able to expand, verse, instead of Ephesians 2, 8, and 9, it's Ephesians 2, 1 to 10, and you get a whole text out of it. But anyway, pick a text, explain why you've picked it, pick more than one text, and if you don't have, maybe you don't have a favorite Old Testament reading, that's fine, because you're just, you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or something like that, or you really like Romans, or you really like Galatians. That's fine. And, make a note that the Old Testament reading is up to pastor's discretion or pastor's choice for the Old Testament. Why? Because I don't have a favorite. And that's fine. Just write it down. No one's going to judge you if you don't have a favorite Old Testament text. Maybe if you don't have a favorite gospel reading, that's maybe a problem. I don't know. Go to church. Hear a good sermon every once in a while, and maybe you'll find a favorite text. That's a joke. Don't get offended. Hymns to confess. What are some of your hymn favorites? You see there's got a couple of lines there. You've got a why. What hymns do you like? Where do you find them? What's the hymn number? In what hymnal? So is it it's LSB 606, it's LSB 842, it's LSB, it's in the TLH because it's the old hymnal. Maybe we can make the old hymnal work. It depends. But maybe there's a hymn in the old hymnal that you don't have in the new hymnal, and there's a reason why it's not in the new hymnal, but people are hard to change. So, write down hymns if you have any hymns. Write down why you chose those hymns, why you like them. Is it the tune? Is it the words? Is it the verse? I really like verse 2. I think it really speaks to, what I think is important about our testimony to Jesus and his resurrection, whatever. And then the rest of it is additional information for your family's benefit, your pastor's benefit, those sort of things. Do you have a will? Where is it located? Is it in a safety deposit box? Is it buried in the backyard? Is it in your top dresser drawer? Does your daughter have it? Does your sister have it? Who's got it? Where is it at? Funeral home. Do you have a preference? Have you made arrangements with Burns Kish, or have you made arrangements with this person or that person, or Mishler Funeral Home, or whatever? Let us know if you've got things prepaid for, and what contact person you work with, and where's the receipt, and what's the phone number, and what do you got pre-planned on that front? What are the pre-arrangements? Have you purchased a casket? Did you want flowers? Did you have a special outfit you wanted to wear? Or do you want to have your glasses on or not your glasses on? Because that's the family thing that people wonder about is, Dad always wore his glasses and he always wore these, and without his glasses, he just doesn't look like Dad anymore. Okay, then put his glasses on. But if you didn't want your glasses on because you don't think of yourself as a glasses-wearing person, I don't know, because they're I don't know, whatever, write it down. It's really helpful if you just write it down. Burial, do you have a cemetery plot? Do you have a tombstone already purchased? Is it, if you're a widow or a widower, have you already purchased the tombstone when you buried your spouse and that it's already there? What company did you buy the tombstone through? Have you already prepaid for your own engraving on the tombstone, or do they have to bring in a new engraver? Those sort of things are important to know. These are details for your family to make the transition easier and to not waste money and time. On the back, what church do you want to be buried at? This is important for those who may have moved in the last couple of years. Do you want to go back to your home congregation? Do you want to go back to where your mom was buried? Do you want to go back to your wife was buried? Do you want to do your now local church? Do you want to have two churches, have two funerals? Because you're going to have a funeral at your current location and you're going to get the body moved to somewhere else and have another burial at the cemetery. Whatever. Pallbearers, do you have anybody in mind? And their contact information. This is important if you want to have your friends do the pallbearing. If your bowling buddy from, for the last 20 years is, and Bill, your bowling buddy, you don't have your phone number written down. Nobody else has Bill in their phone contacts because he's your friend. So if you want him to be your pallbearer and not grandson Jimmy, then you got to write down his phone number so people can call him and let him know, hey, he wanted you to be a pallbearer. Are you available on March 2nd at 10 a.m.? Like, yeah, of course, he's my bowling buddy. I'll be there. So write down his phone number. Church arrangements, flowers, flag, viewing, pall. That's where you put whether or not you want to have the pall there. Do you want flowers? Are you going to have a flag? Is there going to be a viewing before? Those sort of things. Memorial gifts, where do you want? Sorry, I didn't move the page. Do you want memorial gifts given to the Boy Scouts, to the church, to the garden, to the Kiwanis, to the nursing home, hospice care? Where do you want it to go? Notes for the care of the body. Do you want your organs donated? Do you want to be embalmed? Do you want to be cremated? Do you want to be buried? Do you want a casket? Do you want an extravagant casket? Do you want a NASCAR logo on your casket? If you put a NASCAR logo on your casket, you're going to guarantee to get a funeral pall. Just FYI. Any other notes and additional thoughts? Anything you can think of that you need to write down? Last page, personal history and information. This includes things like where you were born, where you were baptized, what date you were baptized, what's your confirmation verse, what's your confirmation hymn if you have one, what church were you confirmed in, where is your church membership at, who did you marry, what's your anniversary date, what's your children's names, what's their addresses. This is helpful for your pastor because if you fill this out, you're going to make a copy for me, you're going to make a copy for yourself, you're going to make a copy for whoever's going to be in charge. I might not know all the names of your children, and I might not know their phone number and addresses, and I don't know that your daughter Susie is in Arizona, and when she calls me on the phone, I don't know is this person related? Who is this person making demands on my time and saying I have to have a eulogy? Grandchildren, great-grandchildren, this is for the obituary, and work organizations, hobbies, major life events, so on and so forth. Again, this is obituary information for your kids when they need to make an obituary at the funeral home. Everything's written out and made a copy of. They don't have to try to remember all the things you did in your life and the things that you were proud of. So, if you need to add additional sheets, you can add different sheets. If you're busy and you have lots of organizations, lots of clubs, lots of things you've done. Do that. List of location for important legal, financial, and personal documents, birth certificates, marriage licenses, will stocks, bonds, titles of property, bank account numbers, insurance policies, etc. Add computer passwords. How do you log into your online account for this? How do I cancel your internet radio service if I don't have your name and password? And it's a pain. If I could just log in and hit the cancel subscription button, it would be a lot easier than trying to make a phone call convincing the person that you're dead and that you need to cancel their service. So add in login passwords to that too. Okay. There's all the details. I've spent 50 minutes talking about all the sort of practical things. I've yelled at you, and I've told you the things that are best practices. Why should you believe me in any of this? Because I've done 25 to 30 funerals. Have you planned 25 to 30 funerals? Probably not. I have seen good funerals and bad funerals. I have seen good things and bad things, and I've seen the drama of poor planning and poor structure and the chaos and disorder of the days after death. And I tell you in all sincerity that an hour spent on these sheets will save days of turmoil and disorder and confusion. It's worth filling it out. And if you don't have I'm told that you should have a will. Get a will, I guess. Do the other stuff. Talk with a financial advisor, all those sort of things. Talk with a funeral director. Sometimes, and I saw this in some of the books that I've read, that pastors and funeral directors don't get along because they're both trying to be in charge of the thing, and pastors have their territory and funeral directors have their territory. We're both trying to do the right thing, and one's trying to do a customizable service and one's trying to be faithful, and sometimes the plans conflict, and one person will say, oh yeah, you can do this, and then you talk to the pastor and like, no, you can't do that, and then who lied to whom, and people get upset. And I will tell you this, that funerals are often more expensive than they have to be, and money is made by funeral directors by selling you things, selling you options, selling you customizations and all of that. Church funeral is a flat fee, and even that isn't necessarily required. Funeral directors will make sure that I get paid for doing the service. They'll make sure that the organist gets paid. They'll make sure that the cleaning group gets paid, or that there's a donation given to the church. All of those things are technically optional, and if your family comes to me and says, we can't really afford a full-fledged funeral, we don't have the money for it, we didn't have a life insurance policy, we still like to have a funeral for dad or whatever, all those fees get waived in the church. Funeral directors aren't waiving any fees. I don't have to be paid for a funeral. The organist doesn't have to be paid. The cleaning crew can get covered by the church, and we don't have to have a rental because we're not paying down debts on a mortgage. And so, when thinking about costs and things, if you're trying to save money, a funeral at a church can and be a place to save money. And they might say, well, you're going to charge more because they got to transport the body back and forth and whatnot. They're always going to find ways to charge more money. That's what people do. That's what businesses do. Church is not a business. The funeral director pays these people because the family wants to give a gift to these people, the people that serve them in their time of need. And so it's a gift. It's not owed to us, but it's a gift for the service given in their time of need. You're not like if you don't pay me because I did your cousin's funeral, you're not going to get a bill in the mail, sort of thing. So that's the only statement I have on that. But anyway, so I hope you found all of this information helpful. It's meant to give you information. It's meant to equip you to understand where your pastor's coming from, where the church is coming from, what I want to encourage the church to understand, and what I want you to think about, because more than likely you have been more influenced by the culture and the cultural customs than the churches. Because I don't preach on funerals. The church doesn't usually preach on funerals. We preach at funerals, but you don't preach on funerals at funerals. I'm not going to tell you about what a funeral ought to be when the funeral itself is chaotic and not doing what it ought to be. I don't have 3 hours in the pulpit to tell you what you should and shouldn't do, and that here at the funeral home you really should have been at the church, and I really am disappointed that you're not at the church, and this is reason why. And that's not the time and place. And the time and place on Sunday isn't necessarily from the pulpit. We're preaching the gospel. We're preaching law and gospel. We're being edified by Christ and His life, death, and resurrection. And so, funerals aren't necessarily the topic of the day, and have to be a topical sermon, and I don't like those very much. So this is the occasion. This is when you get information from your pastor about funerals and what they want, and theologically what the church has done for ages, and why, and what it's confessing. So I hope this has helped. I hope this has been informational. I hope you have enjoyed these videos. I hope that if you didn't get to attend the workshop, that these have been a good supplement. And if you did attend the workshop, that this is a helpful review of the material. If you'd like the pre-planning worksheets, again, you can get the book. You can stop by my office. I have extra copies. You can just let me know, and I can drop them off at your house, or I can send you a letter with them in there. So just, and then come back with them. Drop them off at the office with Mary, and we'll make copies, and we'll get them back to you, because I want a copy in my files so that I know what sort of has been planned and what you want and what we're trying to accomplish and what story we're trying to tell. So make a copy for me. We'll make a copy for the church. We'll make a copy for you. We'll make a copy for whoever you're going to put in charge of that. So if you need 3 copies, 4 copies, 5 copies, whatever. We've got a copier. It works really well. It's fast. It will take 5 minutes to make a copy. So those are my encouragements. That's my instruction. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'm done talking about death and funerals until Ash Wednesday. And we'll get back to it, I suppose. So have a great rest of your week. I'll see you on Sunday. Have a good day.